is, as they are, whose understanding shines forth as the sun, unclouded by defilements or traces of ignorance, who teaches and uses the revelation of the Father for his only Son, all creatures caught in the prisons of sorrow, confused in the darkness of their ignorance, overwhelmed by their suffering. You, whose dragon-like cultivation of the Dharma arouses us from the stupor of our delusions and frees us from the iron chains of our karma, whose powerful sword of wisdom shoots down suffering wherever its rights appear, clearing away the darkness of all ignorance. I entreat you, O Manjushri, whose fleeting body is adorned with 112 marks of Buddha, who has completed the 10 stages, achieving the highest perfection of a Bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning. O Manjushri, O loving one, the rivers of your wisdom, illuminate the darkness and close my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts I've explained. Sashi Prakishuchi Metatram, Viravniji Nidhi Pandi, Sangye Shindu Mintu Wadi, Doko Namda Shivaja Vash, Ida Guru Ratna Mandala Kapnivayatayami.
Sangye Jalan Sodin Chanala, Chanche Badu Dare Kyasuchi, Dagi Chishi Personu, Rola Vishti Sangye Rupara Sho, Sangye Jalan Sodin Chanala, Chanche Badu Dare Dagi Chishi Personu, Rola Vishti Sangye Rupara Sho, Sangye Jalan Sodin Chanala, Chanche Badu Dare Kyasuchi, Dagi Chishi Personu, Sangye Rupara Sho. Kangi Tuzini Zone, Tawa Tamji, Pambi Chere, Tambi Chin Punji, Shabin Pela Chance Lo. Good morning. Sumbanin Kursochis. Sechitar Chawan Sadre. In the good town de bomb. Yonkor turned in the end of bomb. Dasu Ringun de Guna, Tezishin never chas.
So let's go back to the text. So we are looking at guarding against all deteriorations as part of the way to train in the conduct of guarding the mind by means of mindfulness and introspection. The way of training in the ethics of refraining from negative actions was divided into two sections. We're now covering the second section, which is guarding against all deteriorations. Now, we are now looking at point A, guarding against deterioration of the trainings of the body. The third point in that is examining the motivation of thought when acting. So in looking at the second point, extensive explanation, we have covered the first 2 points in that section. Today we're going to pick up from the third point, which is how to act when you're the recipient of gain and honor in verse 51. Let's read through verse 51. It says, what to do at a time of praise and so forth. When wishing for gain, honor, and fame, wishing for servants and entourage, if one's mind wishes for service, at these times remain like a piece of wood.
아니 또 시진기 아니 시버 체체니 아니 저 가야 맞고 베게다 신진베 아니 대대 거에디 내 담보와야 아니 님보 약수치 차그래 수고서리.
At a time in which attachment arises, at a time in which a mind of passion arises, where the mind seeks or wishes for gain, honor, and so forth, it is probably this section is saying that the best antidote for beginners for the time being is to recognize that, to let, as introspection knows that to remain like a piece of wood and not act upon it.
yen dewe nangla ya norla soba nyeba tang kurdi tang den dimo soba nyembi tabo yonkor tendu nyeba ons dagi sem kunyi soba rinjun dewa ngena titsi shi jendu nyimbo sonto ba nebar chavos.
The commentary to this section says, also at these times, one should remain like a piece of wood while having the power of the antidote. When wishing for gain and wealth and so forth, when seeking the honor of putting down one's mat and so forth, wishing for a good reputation, wishing to acquire servants and entourage, and if one's mind wishes for service such as treatments for the body and so forth.
Da shendon la sambitse jiba shendon la sambitse da shendon la samba sena masena anchi chanju kusam nyamnen gombe kap chonju nyamnen chi kap rawjile jaba na tanga ju le tambola ya shutere dos dice ani kandasta gores laungi shendon yarwa to bata randun yewer de bata mawa de bi semchona tezishi ne barchas.
Next point in the outline says how to act when thinking of others' welfare. So how to act when thinking of bodhicitta, for example, or here, as we engage in Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life, how to act when having such wishes or intentions. So when wishing for the welfare of others, when cultivating bodhicitta or the instructions of Shantidevas is when casting aside the welfare of others and desiring one's selfish aims and having a mind wishing to speak, at these times remain like a piece of wood. So if during these occasions you do not act, but you remain like a piece of wood, then you don't engage in the things that are prohibited.
Govadi, Shendun Sambi Govadi, Druya Kaburos, Dinza, Pena, Tangan Tandado Jimbaina, and Dindi Chungalaya, Sam Digis Mondova, Pena, Joju Dojilaya, Katsuta Tudujin Debaina, Tangoni Pendoyo Saris, Ra.
So there are certain occasions where we do not act, we do not engage in actions that are prohibited. But still, also when looking at other occasions where we're training in the welfare of others, we're considering the welfare of others, and thoughts of discarding the welfare of others arise when self-centered thoughts or thoughts that are focusing on one's own welfare arise. Even though at this point in time we do not engage in actions that are prohibited, still they make our attitude that, or our intention to be of benefit to others, become powerless, has no ability. So also at this point in time, when such thoughts of discarding the welfare of others or pursuing our own self-interest arise, we should, as much as possible, exert control over them. And for example, here, we're studying Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life. So particularly, so for example, when we're studying this topic, then it's good to make sure that our mind does not wander off, but as much as we can, that it stays focused on the welfare of others in studying a manual like this.
The shogin is Nisam Sanyadi, Begushia Dodi, and Pena Tangado Jimbaina, Chuju Ginyamne, Yahu Yomari, Koya Tetsam Yomari, Menaya Pena Nigi, Kotsuchiki, Kowaji Lumba Chevalaya, and in Chuju de mantala ya tsar nishu sanga dindichi masi vaina ngi kolang mar samgudos denza kyan chugi chunju di koya hu chala ya yang ranga tsar chiki bi nyesam che tsamayimba yang sigoya di pe maswa kichimbo reshas ro komji teyagi tabiya shudi yang samno taya yang taya yang gomya digi komji tegir modo tsar chiki teni komji tesedi zawni yong samaras.
So that with that in mind, Geshe, I would like to ask you to then consider the following. So Geshe set up with respect to himself is not a good practitioner of this set of instructions. It's not that he knows this set of instructions very well. And when he looks at what Shantideva says here in his Gata Bodhisattva way of life, it's clear in his mind. He says that there is a need to go over those instructions repeatedly, again and again, 20 odd time, in order to familiarize one's mind with the sets of instruction. Doing it as a one thing off is not going to cut it. And therefore, also, when we think of the way that we engage with those instructions, sometimes we have that impression that we're studying this text and it's going to be like a one-time off thing. But it is not to be done in such a way. After all, we've been so accustomed to an attitude of self-cherishing, discarding the welfare of others since time without beginning and up to now. So we need to repeatedly engage in the study of the manual like that, to repeatedly think of its import, to repeatedly meditate on the meaning of that. One time off is not going to be enough. We need to do it 20, 25 times or more.
Tirta yang ani sambayna komdi tegiyabadi nyamnyong rojiki shebanesro bena chigmulam chunjala yongde jik jacha jatama yunguyo saresro namji ani mulamgi kabki ta nyamne chedan chik sunguyo mulam kabki nyamne che di sedula yang komba chibi togi mulam namala ani nyamne che chik chagre mado ani ni makhu kala komji khaya matemba ji ni kala ani nyamne yong chik zawni ta sigma ro.
So having to do it repeatedly has a point. There is a point in saying that, for example, if you want those practices to affect you, even as far as affecting your dreams, so that even within your dreams, you'd be able to put them into practice, you need to repeatedly put it into practice during the wake time. When you're awake, to train in that, to practice repeatedly, to familiarize your mind again and again with that, to the point in which even in your dreams, you are able to put it into practice. If you do not repeat that during the time in which you're awake, you'll have no ability to do it when you're asleep or when you're dreaming.
Tildangi khashini trosana da ngan dango mulam stansa yedi tagas tangazo chobona zainza nga malini chogi tan digi ridi yon chogoni ya drone digi mulam namala ya ta ri korang pedi eni chi gombak sorochi ta chembu shuchi dindich jesonsra dinpa drone digi inga do ki shuchi rigan ba chamon thong desa jilaya in Ganzo Robert in the David Galaya, and Pajo Chogi Ridachi in Sakangalo, than the Sulu to that. And it be sing the Damba, the Dinyam, the Tikila, made a to and Sushu, the Nanzu saying, Ridican to Lidra, Ridican to Lady Tanganzuta, that may not Tangan Suyados resume. Meter jasa sangya million tangi sang that sick dogro samsung tangashi dogre samsung roch angi mixim chin mixim danta ta kamachi gosama dindro sam sick dogyoch mixim dandu dedi lemon kachi jilo mixim dandu lem chik tenda gatsa pede The thing I'm mixing my giant the country in the Malum Sunjilania, near Revachosadi, and Javasunga Beson, the Mixemalaya, Yon de Adi, near 2,000 Denguiovanza, Dirima the Shamba, Delia Shugi, mixing anything Kayamaras raw.
So Geshe mentioned letting that, becoming so familiar with that, repeating that again and again, to the point in which even your dreams are affected by. It's a thought of sharing with us a dream that he had last night. You know, in some sense, it's okay to do it. We're close to each other, so it's all right even to speak about our dreams. So it was hanging up in his dream. He was hanging up with some friends up at the hills of Malini. They were sitting somewhere in a meadow, and there was a gompa over there, a monastery that was quite nice. And all of a sudden, a landslide, a terrible landslide has occurred, but it was also involved with wildfire. So everything was rushing towards them. So massive rocks and flash floods and raging fire was coming down the hill. And it was just maybe 100 meters away from them. And Geshe in his dream thought that that's it. No, it's probably in a minute we'll all be engulfed by fire. So he was sitting, kind of closing his eye, bending his head down, and he started to recite the Mixema. Right? So he said that since this is kind of the end, then just kind of put your head down and recite Mixema. So as he was reciting it, he noticed that nothing is happening. He's not engulfed with fire. So he opened his eyes and the whole wall of fire has been blocked, has been stopped through the recitation of Mixema. So Geshe just brought up this point because that has great faith and trust in Lama Tsongkhapa and really likes this practice that is involved with the recitation of Mixema. So if you become so acquainted with that during the time that you're awake, it can also affect your dreams. Another dream that Geshe had was that all of a sudden we had lots of tigers around here, from the art center coming up the hill. It just kind of lots of tigers for some reason, and not only lots of tigers, also roaring in such a nice voice. Anyway, the dreams were quite tumultuous, and Geshe thought of sharing it with you guys. Anyway, we looked at verse 52 that made a point with respect to practices such as compassion in the mind of enlightenment. So we studied Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life. So if we make effort in study, reflection, and meditation in a repeated way of this manual, it will enhance and increase our practice of compassion and bodhicitta. The commentary to verse 52 says, when one considers the welfare of self and others, and one casts aside the welfare of others, wishes to work only for one's own welfare, and has a mind wishing to speak, such a person should remain like a piece of wood.
데리다 띵이 디상거다 마을 데비 센존의 대지신이 내버 차세야디 아니 비 카로 데데바기 간줄이야 다지 가서다 차단 탁부 슈지 차단 원규와 슈지야 바이나 다디 내가라야 카로 데투바이나 다야 고보 마무지 주고레스 다 이내야 전주 원이 전주냐는 제등이지 다른 상담 대바이나 and 대장 그거 친구 매겨도지 델리 아니 마원 데비 샘종체 근데 깨게 대바로 소종지 전주도 숙체스겨 로 and 디치 전주 양양 때 대바이나 아니 샘샹가 아니 마요와치 전주 코로나야 때 아니 나니 전주 숙체스겨 된다듯삼 어두신 로바이나 덴덴 아니 간줄이야 펜도 용사리스라
These two lines say, and having a mind wishing to speak, at these times remain like a piece of wood. So there are occasions in which strong anger, attachment, and so forth become manifest in our mind. And through this strong manifest state of mind we wish to speak, at this point, it might be that in a worldly way or an ordinary way, we could accomplish something that is significant, something that is of great purpose. Still, from the viewpoint of Shantideva's text, whatever we accomplish through anger, attachment, and so forth, if we speak motivated by these two, whatever we accomplish is going to be of a lesser significant. Also, the purpose of Shantideva's text would also be reduced, would also be small. So then, at times when we find the mind to be overpowered by anger, attachment, and so forth, then rather than speaking of certain purposes that these afflictions motivate, if we could actually recite some verses from Shantideva's text, think this at these times of Shantideva's text, that would be better. So think about it, rather than speaking of other things, if we're able to recite verses from Shantideva's text, if we can repeatedly think of the meaning, we'd be able to accomplish a greater purpose.
ngaba chuwa dan shimbo so debitsi chidar chawanes muzu lelo jigbatang tejin chilto murchotang rangi shojin semjona tezi shijin nebar chas.
The last verse in the extensive explanation of examining the motivation of thought when acting is how to act when you wish for fury and discouragement, etc. to arise. So, as I said previously, you can also read it as when fury, discouragement, and so forth wish to arise, how to act in those occasions. So, it says in verse 53, thank you, 53. When being impatient, lazy, and afraid. Likewise, when stubbornness, incoherentness, and a partisan attitude arise, at these times remain like a piece of wood.
Lelu jigba chongi se pena dani ni be lelu so an teda chongi se shinjin do ne ba cha go se sonya di shinjin do ne se de la ya ko mondra le chosa res ro shinjin do ne slaundi pena tembu chine de ji la ya ko chosa res pena long nang marmen ra na long ka kyo ro ji ro tembu zao ni yo maros Mahi Bapi, any Shindong, and a lot Yatamon Brazil, Shindong Jigibaina, long Kazujan, Gujo down to Maros, and it piggy, control down, Shimbala Sobi, any new long Kazus in Long Javaina, Rangi Samdi, 아니 신동 만신진 아니 템부진 데투바이나 아니 데투바 어딘지래야 고쳐서레스.
What to do when one wishes to generate anger or sadness, when wrath or fury are about to arise, or when laziness of looking down on yourself, when you fall prey to discouragement arise. Shantideva says that you should remain like a piece of wood. At this time, remain like a piece of wood. So, what is the meaning of remaining like a piece of wood in these occasions? Well, Geshe reckons that you can think of developing a mind that is steadfast. So there are different ways that you can approach developing a stable mind that is steadfast, like a piece of wood, rather than being susceptible to the movement of anger, laziness, and so forth, which is somewhat, you could say that it is like a candle burning in the wind. So if you leave a candle in the wind and the fire is totally susceptible to the movement of winds, it's not going to be steadfast, it's not going to be stable. But if you're protected by closing a window, or put it in a place that is protected, then it doesn't matter how strong the gale is, the fire or the flame is going to remain stable. So do not allow your mind to be stirred by the winds of anger, by the winds of laziness, and so forth. Develop a mind that is steadfast. That's Geshe feels is the import of what Shantideva says here. Remain like a piece of wood.
Tereda ina zodi kondro kiwi kalaya techidan kazing imang of chibdozer kondro di kiwi kalaya zo nimute di sabatere dos ro ta kondro laya kiwi kalaya sabayonya di gyendeng ta nam yishu de der ta gyendeng nganjo kondro nyemi chi sambachi mena ani kabdo laya kondro kiwi kalaya sabakom sedi the cow shows red as well.
It mentioned here is those occasions in which you should remain steadfast, like, for example, when anger arises. So what is the antidote for anger? The antidote that we've mentioned previously, it is patience. But then in order to be able to apply the antidote to anger, you need to repeatedly and regularly remind yourself of the drawbacks of anger. Without being mindful of the shortcomings of anger, you will not be able to apply the antidote to anger when it arises.
공무원 내주 작은서 네번 예절했어. 디리지 네번 예투바이나 아니 콘트 기비가 당아주 콘트 마방에서 콘트 깬데 채운데 콘트 기그레스 이네 기비가야 땡땡 소버kom 투야지 연구여서레스.
So we need to think regularly of the drawbacks of anger. We need to regularly remind ourselves that when anger arises, we only have faults, we don't get any benefit. We only get suffering. We don't become happy when anger arises. So this is what we need to remind ourselves repeatedly again and again, so that when there's an opportunity or an avenue for anger to arise, rather than immediately letting it take its course, through previously reminding ourselves, having reminded ourselves of the drawbacks of anger, we'd be able to prevent it from arising.
초와단 동화 속 무저바단스 레 다라 페나다 동화 용이 깔이야 먼저래 지 참만지고 용이 깔이야 드니 기 겐체지네 아니 샘리야 무저바 아니 동화쇼 나데 용기어러스 대야 아니 동화 피기 정내딩 다 somban 신기 아니 땡종부터네 동할 상당 두바이나 동할 세디 규데 켈 때는 연구여바 직당 다가스 소소다 자원이 제가 매버지 아니 소소 돌아야 동하디 용 머시바지 임바디 모요네슬 상당 두바이나 동화 용이 칼이야 아니 지 용외바다 용 척바지 리와 삼비게 상호지 코르투서레스 디토바이나 아니 동화 단행기 소바싱이디 곰투여서레스라
The commentary says at these times one should remain like a piece of wood while practicing the antidote, when being impatient due to anger or suffering. So when anger arises or when suffering arises, particularly when suffering arises in our continuum, it is easy to develop a mind that cannot tolerate that. Right? Intolerance arises in the face of suffering. So at this point, when we can remind ourselves that suffering is a conditioned phenomenon, it arises in depends upon certain conditions. Suffering arises in depends upon causes and conditions. It's not that it arises randomly in a way that is not related to us at all. Suffering is a dependently origin phenomenon, so that when the cause and conditions for that are right, suffering will arise. So through that, we do not fall prey to intolerance, and we're able to make sure that the sense of being unable to tolerate suffering does not arise in our mind stream.
Gyawal mudruvi ledu wangi gyawal druva sola jikpatans. Tadir dingang ya sajana ya anu chowa da shumba sayati. Shumba sayati, the shumba di kani ina yon chodas. Ni jungu mari ni tugu mari sambi danyan nibi lelo dia ani shumba. En kashi jik karsota jik samba ma kipa chichin. Ro ani pe ani shum de dindri la soba. Ta yong ka ya ta dongnin chiagi sem magi ka ya dongnin chiadi ani sem jigi sogo ya ta di nimbo di ani zo di zönju dang ani poba singiti gogres yawron di sungudas.
Also, when being afraid of practicing virtue and so forth due to laziness, then being afraid, rather than saying being afraid, you can also read that as being unenthused of practicing virtue and so forth due to laziness. So you can be unenthused about it, not being too delighted in the practice of virtue because of laziness. And there are different types of laziness. One of them is laziness of discouragement, in which you could be discouraged because you have a low self-esteem. You think that, how can someone like me do it? I will not be able to accomplish that. I will not be able to practice that. So having such a low self-esteem is considered to be laziness of discouragement. Or another type of laziness of discouragement is when your mind is, when you feel down, unhappy, depressed, and so forth. When your mind is unhappy, you do not develop enthusiasm. You do not delight in virtue. So this section says, again, looking at this section, at this time one should remain like a piece of wood while practicing the antidote, when being afraid or being unenthused of practicing virtue and so forth due to laziness that is not joyful about virtue.
Dirida bena shumba yongyadi semgi natsa yongyadi shumbi tonida ani ji jidan rig mambu jile ya chembe gi tonida ji chunjung kala ya ani netsun dhamma chongde so ani ya tensu chi ani di toni ani semba makiwa chi da kar samgon da nga chi phomsha nga dukja chesha samsong ko tindi kya samtang de baina ani susu semdi be shim roya chi chagwa sares ra.
There are ways in which a mind becomes discouraged. Sorry, before we do that, I just forgot something from the previous speech. So the antidote to that, laziness, is developing a sense of self-courage. self-confidence, right? So becoming self-confident about one's own abilities. So then with respect to discouragement of being, for example, depressed and mind being down and so forth could occur because of reminding ourselves repeatedly of bad things that we have experienced in the past. It does happen that when we tend to dwell repeatedly on negative events or negative situations that have occurred to us in the past, we do that again and again and again, our mind is increasingly made more discouraged.
Rikshon Senamadu, Komshiki, Kiabachik, Drogas, Penangandu Chunjun Kalia, Nachunjun Kalia, Nalo, Troop doing Mikalia, Manzunamaya, Pugu, Tudu Peshe, Pug, yes, and a Pamani, Momo, ni Ashan Diores, Ashan the Pe Long Sour, Ashan Pe Long Sour, in the Ashangi, Ashan Koran Yodi, Pigi Nang Kima Delia, Metantes and Ramdela, Ashan Koran Dechi, and it Sakalasas, the Nikudera. 아니 니트나 타포츠가 콘도 쇼사르티 년다 쇼탕그레 먼저리 빅바다 도다 가르라나 슈그레로 슈그레 아니 포 참아고 아산 요디 큐니 깨거리 잡혀 말다 아산 슈시고 이내야 아산라야 마가바지 삼로디 페나가도 자우님 콜마뉴스 소소레 딘디지 비 시나요레 년다 땅게 요데 아산라야 자우님 nga dukja chesu nga duk tang du samsong ro sol ma nyos di themba ina nga shu dukja che du asan ko ni ji samsong ro nga la shu dukja che samsong sam zaw ni khol gum dus.
So we sometimes tend to repeatedly remind ourselves of negative events that have occurred to us before. So Geshe said that when he was a kid growing up in his family encampment in a nomadic area in Tibet, there were, around the time that he was 6, 7, or 8, there were 8 other kids, brothers and sisters that he had, right? So they were all living in the same tent. So his parents, his grandmother, quite a few kids, and also his uncle was there as well. Now, his uncle was quite an angry person. He used to get angry quite a lot, and he used to sit in the middle of the tent, right? So there was a stove in the middle, so it produced some heat. Also, his bed was there, so this is where it was also, that was his, you could say, his bed, or where he was lying down in that encampment. And during those times where he had a foul state of mind, where he was angry, kind of all the kids were tiptoeing all the time, kind of just staying away from it, kind of the angry uncle, because his uncle used to either hit them with a stick or throw stones at them, or just strike them when he was angry. He was an angry person. But Geshe says that at these times, they just kind of, everyone thought of just staying away from his uncle, rather than thinking that he's such a bad person, holding on to a sense of resentment, thinking that this is such an evil person. You just try to stay away out of his reach. So Geshe says that it's not that when he thinks of those events, it's not that he thinks about them with this kind of thinking that his uncle was an evil person. Things that actually, it was quite a sad state of mind to have, a sorry state of mind, having compassion to his uncle. And just remembering that kind of everyone were trying to stay away from his uncle rather than thinking that he's such an evil person.
Reda asan chilo la dro tangan drop bar da chiri se da tindi chocolate dro de mi kon ton yo marwa da asan chilo la dro ni sul le na asan ngan pu gu le ya chiri ni sum dro da tindi da jaji ja da nyem ba khim gres tangan zo asan gu de da asan de dus la na pedi gyudor da gyushal dro asan za tham na asan les in nang le sadi asan le she da shu she da 간지 샘 나노라야 아산의 세나 요르다이나야 디기 수수 샘 나노야 나차서야디 자원인 문도스 디 직진은 땅안 조리 쇼도 개발이라 난 더발에 가시 뭐 춘중 거래 찍는 두자주 뒤 있다는 건 나고도 세서 디에 딩한테 개발지를 했었어.
So they were living in a nomadic area, and every once in a while his uncle used to go to town. So when you live like that as a nomad, you don't see chocolates and candies and so forth. It's not that they're easy to come by. So when his uncle used to come back from his trip to town, he used to bring like a couple of candies to each child. So that was something to look forward to. So when they heard that their uncle is on the way, then all the kids used to rush out and kind of run towards the uncle and greet him. They knew that there are some candies in store. But then when he got into the tent, then everyone knew to stay away from him. So outside, everyone was rushing out to greet him. Inside, kind of you tiptoed around him. So Geshe says that maybe it's a cultural thing, not kind of thinking about him still with a sense of resentment, or thinking that that person has always been bad, and having some mental baggage, so to speak, with respect to them. During the time that Geshe has been here, he had some conversation with some people that had some scars, so to speak, from past events, and something bad have happened to him in the past, and they couldn't really let go of the thought of seeing that person as an evil person. So Geshe just wanted to bring that point up. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Again, it seems that the kids, Geshe's brothers and sisters, were scared of the uncle, but without that baggage of thinking that he was such an evil person.
But then there's that dimjigi sem magiba yongya di zo di tang ninji dang dimji la ya jik sang dang to na ten pensa res penangi ashan to ta kola ninji ani control sau shore ma do yang kola ngzu mangdong sa le di ngzu la nyemba nyoya la soba dimji chego ras ta di chi di ta kola control sau sho inza ta ning woni ninji go ya chi ma do kola ya ma ga chi go ya gi junsen zao ni ro ani ta megyo to jre do ro.
Anyway, thinking about this verse, so as Geshe said, with respect to his uncle, he used to get really angry. He was an angry person, and yet they still rushed out to greet him when he used to come back, because he had quite a lot of presents in store. So thinking about him, then you think that such a person with an angry mind is an object of compassion. They're in a pitiful state. Geshe feels that there is no lingering effect of disliking, in sense of strong dislike to that person, rather than thinking that it was in a pitiful state. Having strong anger in your mind is a pitiful state.
아니 콘로 사대요 원시다 맨나 콘로 마사지로 디젤이야 아샹 고난 비게 그 로가 차디 마바드로디 아니 드라사기 게메디 원침부 쇼저다 빈고저다 빼원침부 아샹 싸우니 노마이문도 그 디디라 양사마 저르스라 근데 이내 간조 때로 아샹다 게메 원침부여디 게메 등간조 핑게레 빠베기 시무 포모르라 빠베 시무 포모르
Kolaçansa geber
제 빠베 시무 포모다 니 아메 핑게트즈 롭치다 로라 치쳐라 아니 딜라 드로치니 된 간조 아샹 로버치가 드고요 디즈여디 신 루야다 단 로버로 다 자꾸야 신다 부신 루야 간조 디즈 동벌로 아샹 로버치 디티기야 then rosa da ashan betin long line make chasa dingi kyazun cheme da di.
Sometimes you get addicted to anger. The word for addiction, so to speak, in Tibetan has a connotation that you fall into this bad habit. You get so used to it or hooked to it that it's like getting addicted to it. So anger is just like that, isn't it? And often it seems that when you're in a position of power, then you tend to get more angry. And when you lose your power, maybe anger is dimmed. So with Geshe's uncle, when he was kind of in the tent, he was quite like a powerful person. He had some power control. So he used to get angry in quite a lot of situations. But then he got married and moved to another household where the woman was powerful. She was the one that had the power in the family, and he became tame like a puppy. No, it wasn't getting angry at all. It seems that anger went away because he had less power in that situation. So he got angry to the daughter of another uncle. So kind of I raised my inner eyebrows with respect to that. And Geshe said actually kind of there was like an uncle from the mother's side got married to the daughter of someone from the father's side. Anyway, the whole Tibetan family shebang. So Geshe said that they used to, after he got married and moved to another encampment with that powerful woman, the kids used to go out every once in a while and help him gather wood. Right? You live in a tent, you live in an encampment, you need wood, firewood. So they used to go out every once in a while and help him. And it seems that kind of he was totally subdued. He wasn't angry anymore. He was under the sway of a more powerful person.
This is dinner red. Tinza ani tangazu chik ngalong sawi ngachi chik sadi pigilaya chik. Oyo shesa yebi kav remado. Oyo shesa meba ino jashi jatama ta long di nyong rodas. Tinza long yata ta chik choba marabdi kyama shogyo ji yimba di ta chik komji ji ong yimba di ta sewu shojires. Tinza ta di kabdi dilaya an choba sambu dang samba sambu dindilaya ani komji tembayna an konzo ranshingi ma thodroya chik chagras ro.
Being short-tempered, anger arising and so forth, it arises usually in situations where you have avenues to vent your anger. When you have someone that you can vent your anger at, this is where it's going to happen. Whereas if there are no people around that you feel that you can vent your anger at, that you feel that you can bully or wield your power, it is likely that it will happen to a lesser degree, less frequently. So here it's also important to cultivate positive habits, positive ways of thinking. If we continuously habituate the mind with positive habits, positive ways of thinking, there will be less avenues and less situations in which anger will arise.
Je taya rikchilaya samda nibu yodige long den chagmetro samgudos asnanga ju pebegi lama geshi to suzu getu to tilaya on chimbu long sao peyo tasra manche dosra ngi genla ngala long ma utinga long soraj ine onne thanige pegilaya onne thanige nengal leondi on tuzi shuyores ra kadin chimbu shures nia chitang to chik kabye mambu nande yodo chik and ngi lama chimbu mambu to suzu suden da shabshi to zola pe and it samdala ya kabye shu nande dia and cause senda nimu chawndi yan dilichi yung mero sangdos.
And also with becoming angry or being short-tempered with someone, it is likely that you're going to be more angry or short-tempered with those that are close to your heart. At least Geshe said that having grown in a monastic environment, it seems that Geshe's spiritual teachers and so forth, they tend to be more rough, sometimes short-tempered with their attendants, with the helpers, with the students and so forth. Geshe got quite a lot of scolding from his teacher. It seems that there were so many occasions in which his teacher was short-tempered with him, and yet it says that in the great scheme of things, his teacher had a great sense of concern and affection to him. Maybe this is also, you could say that it's a token of how much affection that person has to you. You know, this give you scolding every so often. So in that sense, when someone is being short-tempered with you, a bit angry with you, could you say that it is necessarily a negative situation? Maybe not necessarily. At least Geshe says that when he thinks of his own personal experience, the different things that he experienced in his life, then not all situations in which someone was angry with him was a situation in which that person was an evil person or something bad has happened. So looking again at the commentary, it says, what to do when one wishes to generate anger or sadness, when being impatient, lazy, and afraid. Likewise, when stubbornness, incoherentness, and partisan attitude arise, at these times remain like a piece of wood. At these times when one should remain like a piece of wood while practicing the antidote, when being impatient due to anger or suffering, when being discouraged about virtue and so forth due to laziness, that is not joyful about virtue. Also when being afraid, so we can put being afraid in a different dot point. So when you're afraid, this is also a time in which you can remain like a piece of wood while practicing the antidote. When one is stubborn because of being unrestrained or incoherent, and also when the mind favors one's own side, which means that when you're being biased, so when you're being biased with respect to friends and so forth. Let's look at a synopsis, the summary of examining the motivational thought when acting in verse 54. It reads, having thus analyzed the strong afflictions in the mind striving in meaninglessness, the brave person will then guard the mind steadfastly with antidotes. Then, having investigated the mind that strives in the afflictions and meaninglessness, one should not allow this mind to engage in negative actions with the antidote that is like a powerful hero, but keep it steady.
용 세워지려왔어.
So the section mentions the application of powerful antidote, potent antidote, at a time in which your mind comes under the control of the affliction. So particularly when your mind has fallen under the power of the afflictions, this is the time to apply the antidote. And if you haven't accosted your mind to powerful antidotes, of course, it's not going to happen. So you first of all need to acquaint your mind with these antidotes to make them become potent, powerful, so that you'll be able to apply them in an appropriate time.
니버 샘기 하버 냠버 송와라 숨스. 다 기치슈 디 아니 샘 송야 디. 류가 이숨 예비나니. 류다 나니 디다 샘기 요임바디 요보임바디 먼저 뇽이 주간자다 샘 송고레 샘기 라버 냠버 송와라 숨. 수지 님보 송와다 도모이 님보 공부를 줘수 담보 수지 님보 송와네스. 신도 녜다 랍데다 된다 그도 셰서지 모자시던 직지던 신시신다 젠가 제가 좀
We've finished looking at guarding against deterioration in the training of the body, and now we're going to look at guarding against deterioration in the training of the mind, which is the second point in guarding against all deteriorations, which is a part of the way to train in ethics of restraining from wrongdoing. So the most important thing is to guard the mind. We have body, speech, and mind, and the body and speech are servants of the mind. If the mind commands them to do something, they will do. So here, the most important factor in guarding the training is to guard the mind. Let's look at the outline again. It says there are 3 points: guarding by means of the individual antidotes, the common antidotes, and the way to apply oneself to cultivating the antidote. Let's look at verse 55 to begin with. Strong ascertainment and strong faith, stability, respect, and politeness, knowing shame and having fear, peaceful and striving to please others.
샘 지더송마스 합시 네나나 태점도 로시 밤비 신동에 버탕스 라운디 랍시 네도소 아니 비길이야 태점다 로시 밤이 신동에 고레스 라운디 간지 랍시 네 칸임바디 당보 심바치야 네바치야디 기치슈레스.
Sorry, the commentary says, how to protect the mind. Strongly ascertain the points of advice by abandoning doubt and wrong consciousness with regards to them. So we have the basis of the training. We need to abandon doubt and wrong views with regards to our basic training. Then in developing knowledge, abandoning doubt, abandoning wrong consciousnesses with respect to the basic trainings, we develop strong ascertainment in that we thoroughly understand the points of our training. So that's the first point that is made here, this strong ascertainment, this thorough knowledge of the points in our training.
군조 숨당 랍시 네라 이 체바당 대바당 데베 랍드 대바당 삼줄 템바당 그바당 공랑 dum바드 집이 셰서르 제바당 랑 견전도 치는 예발은 준비 모서 시바당 예믹 삼네 남면은 집바드 제바 온보 시시 치도 차와 젠 가와 제발라 좀버 차워스.
And then it continues in saying, generate strong faith through belief in the 3 jewels and the points of advice, faith and aspiration. Stable intent and practice, being polite by being respectful and humble with everybody. Shame that is fearful of negativity by reason of oneself, which means that shame that refrains from negativity is taking yourself as a reason on account of yourself. Being afraid of the ripened result by contemplating the shortcomings. and having pacified senses and striving for the purpose of making others happy.
Retadi sangiwi chug zawach ro gokyamruni is jug mulu sonjuk pars nam yu yonda korala ya shedan de gokyamruni is laundi gochu sat kyamruni kyamru kyayu konjo somla ya ngonni ki same thing ki iche de tepaching mena ani di gi labjala ya labse di yongya meju jiros tenza ani konjo somla ya tepachang ko ya ro ani 대바 마기바디 끼바 친거야 끼바디 코네 공도 배워 친거야 대바 땡부지 이치 땡부지 여바이나 아니 디 랍샬이야 아니 지 가와 중 니비 까봐야 아니 베 지그다다 집에 토네 아니 테마요야 배바치야디 용거 왔어.
Looking at the steps of the path, beginning with going for refuge all the way up to the state of union, these states of the path are affected by the trust and faith that we have in our objects of refuge. So we do need faith and trust in the objects of refuge. If we lack faith and trust in the object of refuge, we will not apply ourselves to the basic trainings. We will not take those training up if we do not trust the objects of refuge, if we have no faith in them. And therefore, to begin with, we need to train in faith towards the objects of refuge. We need to train in developing trust in them, to the point in which if our faith and trust are heartfelt in the objects of refuge, right, if they become heartfelt, then fear will arise when we discover that we're about to violate the points of our training. So it is important, it is essential that we train our mind in faith and trust in the objects of refuge. Let's read through verse 56. It says, "Do not be put off by the desires of the childish that strive with each other and think with affection they have these minds due to the generation of afflictions."
Dadani nimu kibi rana rama meban dadani semdin jongi nimu da tawa chawo nyambi hinze dembatan ran nimu gi ondu mingyo chawos.
The commentary says, do not be put off by the contradicting desires of childish people, where having benefited one, the other one gets angry. If you let your mind be affected by these desires of other people, in that they benefit those that they like, they get angry with those that they dislike. If you let your mind be affected by that, and only that, you'd be rendered incapable of performing actions or acting in a way that is appropriate. So have compassion for them, thinking this mind is generated within them due to afflictions and without them having any control over themselves. I will liberate them from their afflictions. In such a way, do not fall under the control of the afflictions.
Member Truba Membatar Tumba Nimu Dasigi Nimu Tandre Kanzam Shesumbataros.
From the ornament of the Mahayana Sutras, by thinking of how they are without power due to constant faults possessing the mind, do not hold it against beings. And then Aradevas in his 400 stanzas says, like the treating physician that does not get disturbed despite aggression, The able one says the afflictions, there is no person without afflictions.
Teta domdo di shibgebag song teres ra dinani ta tsigan tamani de tumu nimu dazi gi nimu tandri kanza mes laundi ta tumu sanji chomden de ngansu par khabar di teres ta ra ngansu nimu ki kala ya kha sa di nimu gynden gi kanza la ya kha sha de amado ti ji nimu la ya ani nyanga di tre tuyo marwas sanji chomden de gi gynden gi kanza di maimba ti gi nimu to gi imba di 무슨 아니 간사 순다치가 야 아니 비리에 가서다 마가 침먹어 봐 아니 사망도 찍겼다 두고디 아니 디 돈의 인거로 왔어.
The last two lines in this verse from Aradeva's 400 stanzas can be translated differently. It says, the able one sees the afflictions. There is no person without afflictions. The different translation, and the one that Geshe explained, says that the able ones see the afflictions as the enemy, rather than seeing the person as the enemy. Right? That's a rough translation of a different translation of this line. So the Buddha sees the afflictions themselves as being the enemy. So when afflictions arise and someone behaves under the power of these afflictions, rather than developing a sense of dislike to that person, rather than seeing that person as your personal enemy, recognize that the things that make them act in that way are the afflictions. The afflictions are at fault. So be equanimous in your attitude with respect to persons, with respect to living beings. Do not see them as your enemy, but develop a sense of equanimity towards them, but see the faults of the afflictions.
통인님분이스 카나만토 맹글라 다드 심지 원치시 쪼바신도 남에바 인다도 송어차스.
Let's look at the second point in verse 57 that explains the common antidotes. It says in verse 57, objects free from the unutterable are for self and sentient beings. Without ego, always protect this mind, like an emanation.
대단한게 카나만토 세디 네발에 문제 체드리스 네발에 이샤네 제비 카나만도 와다 장신이 카나만도 디니 메바디 게와레스 메빙무보디 게와레스 게웨 제 게와레스.
Now it says objects free from the unutterable. Let's look at actually the second version, the second translation. Maybe it's a better translation. Having control of that which is actually not misted. So that's better. Is myself and other sentient beings. So having control over that which is actually not misdeeds. Again, also here we have to work around the translation. So we have different types of negative actions. We have those which are natural misdeeds and those which are prescribed misdeeds. Right? The two types of misdeeds are those that are natural misdeeds or prescribed misdeeds. The absence of those misdeeds is virtue. Let's look at how we try to translate this, change the translation to fit that. So having control over that which is actually not misdeed, you can say having control over the absence of misdeeds, which means virtue. When you have control over the absence of misdeeds, you have control over virtues.
진짜 제베나물에 제랑기 칸나만도 maybe giving obola jubichedo chawa da minyam padam simjen thamjela phimbi wandu cheshi toni tobi sheregi simbi gones gyumata tuba chawa cheba shendu ngargeta losom meba rangi yigde tawdu sonor chawos.
The engagement in virtuous actions free from accepted and natural negativities or prescribed and natural misdeeds is for the purpose of oneself, not degenerating, and for the benefit of sentient beings. Engage in actions as if they are illusions or emanations by holding them with the wisdom realizing emptiness. Thus, always protect your mind without pride or exaggeration. So we'll leave it here for now. So put the prayers on the screen. Lama Sangye Drogene, Dovachika Malupa, De Salagopa, Rinpoche, Makepa Manteji, Kepanya Pamepa, Kondame Dukawash. Kowe Shingosu, Delan Deva Malujuwe, Shivesi Wantes, Shapesi Teba, Yahweh de Zekyo Bewe Kunzo Topos, Chasum Kowe Lema Tutu, Daso Juje Shante.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geshe. Thank you, Venerable Carson.
Thank you, Geshe, Venerable Carsten.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Geshe, Venerable Carson.
Why doesn't it work? Come.
Question.
How does that work? How does that work? I don't know that she was talking about it. Could be the kettle.